This is People I Know Show, a podcast about interesting people, personal growth, and being wrong. I'm your host, Kurt Karstensen. This is now episode 6 of People I Know Show, and in this episode, I talk with Phil Ferguson, who is the host of one of my favorite podcasts, The Phil Ferguson Show. Phil is a financial advisor by trade and educates his audience on how to invest skeptically. The other focus of his podcast is atheism and related skeptic and science topics. In this conversation, Phil and I discuss a number of personal finance topics as well as why he left religion. And in the Being Wrong segment, Phil explains why he was wrong about psychics. See a photo of Phil and I on Facebook or Instagram by searching People I Know Show. And if you didn't notice, I have marked this episode as explicit because Phil occasionally uses some colorful language. Not often, but it exists, so I wanted to warn you. And be sure to listen to the whole episode. Phil makes a very generous offer to you, the listener, near the end of the conversation, and I think it's one you should strongly consider taking him up on. With that, we enter today's conversation with Phil Ferguson. Phil Ferguson joins the podcast today. Hello, Phil.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing quite well. You have an interesting role in the People I Know Show podcast.
Ooh, schwanky.
Because you, I don't know that well, at least individually. You don't know me almost at all, although we've met a few times, and that's the qualification. But I, in a sense, do know you well because I've listened to your podcast every week for now, I guess it's over 100 weeks, which is a lot. So I've gotten to know you, and you from afar, from a distance, have influenced me. And that's why you're on today for a variety of reasons.
Yay. Hopefully some of it was good influence.
Do you find that hosting a podcast, this happens occasionally where you're having maybe a greater influence and you can see or feel, but then you learn about it later?
Well, it's interesting because I had a blog for 5 years. And I would do 2 or 3 posts a day. And after 5 years, I rose to the level of insignificance. But with podcasting, I do much better. It's much greater impact. And it's a more quality product because my writing skills are very subpar, but my speaking skills are at least adequate. So I think I'm more impactful as a speaker, as an orator, than a writer. But with a podcast, and I'm sure you do the same thing, at some point you have to share a little bit of yourself to make that personal connection with the listener. There's always this delicate line, or if you don't want to share too much, there's some things you want to keep private. And people will and do come up to me at conferences and they know me because if they've listened for 2 or 3 or my other shows, maybe up to 5 years of stuff that I've done, they can know an awful lot about me. And that can be a little freaky for me, but I've kind of gotten better over the time with handling that, and now I see that as appreciation, that they obviously found something valuable in my show to keep listening to it and to make the bold step to come up and say hello to me. So it is something that I appreciate. It's something that I'm humbled by, I'm flattered by, and I always appreciate it. With one exception, I had someone come up to me and kind of awkwardly weave in something, and I was like, that doesn't really fit with our conversation. What are you saying? He goes, oh, I'm quoting you from show number so-and-so 2 years ago. You said that. And I'm like, yeah, don't do that. Don't. Little things maybe, but like a couple of sentences, no. I mean, if you like the fact that I say saving 10% is the suck-ass minimum, and you want to quote that, okay, fine. It's a little quote line, but not like quoting sentences. That just seemed too weird for me. But
well, you made a financial reference there, and I want to go into that shortly because I feel like for people that haven't spent a lot of time really understanding their finances by listening to your podcast over time, you're inevitably going to learn some things, or at least feel like you're in position to learn something. But what I think most interesting and most valuable about kind of knowing you a little bit from afar is you have this sincerity about you where it seems to me you just want the best for everybody. And more than anything, you don't want people to get screwed over. And you live that out in your life through your podcast. And I think for this podcast's existence, I had met you 2 years ago at a conference we were both at. And through a mutual friend and acquaintance, I got to talk to you a little bit. Saw that you had a podcast, started listening. And then I saw you about a year later, and not knowing you very well, I'm not sure if you remembered me, and that wasn't that important because I understand that. But I asked you some advice about, I'm thinking about starting a podcast. What kind of equipment should I get? You told me about it, and then I didn't quite remember. Then I emailed you. You're always so good to respond. And then actually just a few weeks ago when discussing that we might have this conversation right now, I sent you an email, and then literally 2 minutes later, you called me, and it's so, I don't know, there's something about it that I don't feel like most people would do this, but you did it because you probably didn't know who I was at that time, but you called me up just minutes after I sent you this email, and you didn't have to at all. You probably had other things that you could have been doing, but you just do it, and it seems like it's unusual. Do you find yourself to be unusual in that way?
Well, I'm unusual in a lot of ways. Weird thing is I genuinely enjoy what I do to a point that I don't want to say it's inappropriate, but a lot of people don't have the joy that I have in their job, I guess. It's wonderful for me. So when someone wants to talk to me, I really appreciate that. Matter of fact, I was talking to one of my clients just a couple days ago, and we were talking about their investments, and he says, Phil, do you remember the first time we talked? And I go, I don't know that I remember the very first time. And he says, 4 years ago, I called you and we set up an appointment, and you talked to me and my wife for an hour, didn't ask us for money, didn't insinuate that we have to hire you. You just gave us all kinds of advice and sent us on our way. And we did very well with that advice. And then like 2 years later, we decided to hire you. And so we're clients because you were so cool and did everything for free 2 years ago. And I was like, oh, well, that's cool. I'm glad that kind of like that Zen thing where it worked out for me. Uh-huh. But on a regular basis, when I started doing the financial stuff 23 years ago, the whole idea was helping people, educating people, and a small fraction of the people that I would help for free would then hire me. And that model's never changed. So the first most important thing for me is education and helping people not get fucked over. Oh, can I swear? Yeah.
I don't know. No one's sworn on my podcast yet, so I'll have to think about that.
You have to check the box. Just in case, people would talk to me. I want to make sure that they learn things and don't get ripped off. So that's the first and most important driving thing for me to do. If some of those people then want to have more services and hire me, and I get to make money doing that, that's just an extra win on top of helping people. So,
and I suppose even though this may be your innate way of being, it's worked out well enough that you're able to continue it, and you're maybe not and haven't been in a position where you feel like you need to go against your moral compass of what's the right thing to do.
Right. And it's a weird thing in investing, in finance. There's two really big different groups of people. There's the very large and well-financed group of salespeople that sell things, life insurance, annuities, all kinds of fancy products. And their job is to sell. They don't necessarily need to know what they're selling. They need to be good at selling it. And then there's people that really understand how investments work, the theory behind it, the details, the probability, the statistics. And that's all done at universities and graduate schools and economic departments and finance departments. And those two groups don't really meet and interact. And I came through all of this from the academic perspective because I was fascinated by the idea that someday I could make money from money instead of making money from my labor. And I thought, that sounds like something Phil wants to achieve. Mm-hmm. At some point, I want to make money with my money, and I could still work, or I could choose not to work. And that, to me, is the fantasy. That's the goal. So I thought, how does one do that? And only over time did people say, I want to hire you and I want to pay you because of the things that you know. And it turns out to be a lucky hobby, because if I had a hobby of making macrame, I'd be selling things for $10 on Etsy. But instead, people pay me a very generous amount of money to help them make even more money. So that's very cool. But, you know, it's always been about education and teaching and helping people not have problems.
So if we can get into some basic advice for my listening audience, which is in the early stages and hopefully continuing to grow, for someone that hasn't thought much about what they'll do financially some years in the future, and they're more focused on today and then all the, there's a lot of things going on in people's lives that they need to pay for. What do you tell someone in that situation?
Well, one of the things I have, and it was a listener that came up with this little catchphrase, I teach people how to money. And the first part of how to money, which is not necessarily my greatest strength, and it's so simplistic that it's almost embarrassing, you have to spend less than you make. How one does that is not my specialty, but you have to find a way to spend less money or make more money. If you make $25,000 and you spend $26,000, I can't help you beyond the next steps because you have no money. Sometimes people get really focused on what can I do with $10 or $20 in investing? What's the best place to put $20? And I've kind of come to the conclusion that the problem is not where you should put $20. The problem is that you only have $20. You have to find a way to get serious money, tens of thousands of dollars somehow, some way, by making more and spending less. So that's the first step of how to money. I mean, it's simple. It's simple to say, not necessarily simple to do. So the first step of how to money is make more than you spend. The second one is to invest wisely, and that's one of the things that I specialize in, is how does somebody invest wisely? And then the third thing that a lot of people have to understand, at least from my philosophy, it takes time, a lot of time. And unfortunately, sometimes people come to me 5 or 6 years from retirement and they're ready to start saving. They have a serious problem. You need time for this to work. So it takes money, good investments, and time. And if they don't really know much, then I have 3 books I can recommend. Would you like me to do my book recommendation?
Yes,
okay.
And these are good books. I'm only through like 1.5 of them, honestly, but go on.
That's all right. You have time. You're a young guy. You've got lots of time. The first book is a starter book. It's called The Richest Man in Babylon. And I've forgotten the guy who wrote it, but it's something like an 80 or 90-year-old book. So it's out of copyright. So you can get it almost anywhere for $5. It's on Audible, it's on Kindle, it's in paperback, and it's even on YouTube where someone sat down and read the entire book for free. So you can do it. It's The Richest Man in Babylon. It is dated, and so it has some issues that might offend people who are a little more social justice warriors or politically correct. And I wish there was a better version, but work through that.
I have a feeling that if it was written today, you wouldn't be suggesting it, but because it's so far in the past, well, the generations allow people to have some different views back then that might be more acceptable.
Yeah, there's some different views. And the other thing is, when I recommend books, I try to recommend books that have been proven over a long period of time. I do read new finance books that I find are wonderful, but I don't want to recommend a book that came out 1 year ago, because I want to make sure that what it recommends is good, sound advice that works over years and generations. And this has been a sound thing. And it talks about really the first step of my investment is spending less than you make or making more than you spend. And it goes over why you should save money. How do you make money? And it's very entry level. It's very general. It doesn't have mathematics. It's not complicated. It's a short book. So it meets all those criteria. I wish it was less sexist as an example, but it was written almost 100 years ago. So it has some of those temporal issues, but the investing ideas are great, and it's a generally fun read because it's filled with stories. The second book is called A Random Walk Down Wall Street, and this originally came out in the early 70s, and every 5 to 10 years they do a revision and update it. So you could get the version number 1, first printing in 1974, I think it was. And it will still work, but some things have changed in the investment world. So it's nice to have those updates. So you want to get something that's no more than 5 to 10 years old as a version of it. Again, A Random Walk Down Wall Street. And that book is a lot about, this is a stock. This is a bond. This is a mutual fund. This is an open-end. This is a closed-end mutual fund. Here's what a put is. Here's what a call is. And it goes over a lot of words, because sometimes people will call me and they'll use investing or finance words, but they'll use them incorrectly. So it's hard for us to have a conversation when you don't even know the right words to use. And It's just that no one's taught you. It's not made available, and a lot of people in the financial services industry don't really want you to know necessarily how things work because they want to sell you something and just pat you on the head and make you happy. So A Random Walk Down Wall Street. Once you finish those 2 books, and I do implore you to read them in order, even if you know some more things, you might think that the Richest Man in Babylon is too simple, but it's a quick book. Just read it. The 3rd book is Common Sense on Mutual Funds by John C. Bogle, and that's with a B, boy, Bogle, John C. Bogle. He is the founder of the Vanguard Mutual Fund Company in the early 70s. And this book came out, I think, in 97, and it was revised in 07 or 08. So the most recent version is now 10 years old. I'm hoping they're going to revise it again, but I have no knowledge that they will. It really digs in to a lot of data, graphs, charts, tables, and statistical analysis, probabilities, correlations, and it goes into all the reasons index funds are the single one best way to work. But it would be really, really hard to understand that book at all if you hadn't read the previous 2 books. And that 3rd book, I do insist that you get it in paper form. You can get a paperback or a hardback. You can get Kindle and audio too. But if you just listen to this book for 16 hours, you're not going to pick up enough of it. You need to treat it like a textbook. And it may take you 3 months if you're pretty good with this stuff already. It may take you an entire year to go through it. But if you're 50, for example, you might be investing for 30 to 40 years or longer if you plan to leave the money to your kids. So spend some time to figure out what you're doing.
So you've had a big impact on how I invest now, in the sense that I have moved away from having a financial advisor, and I use some of your basic general advice for some of my investing, and I think it works for me. And I feel like, though, it's a long process if you don't really take the time, maybe by reading these books or whatever way. If you don't put the time in, it is so confusing that people are going to need to have an advisor. And certainly there are a lot of people working in that job or using that term for someone who has an advisor right now. What are the key things from the people that do that job well and the people that you think aren't doing it well? What are some of the things that someone who doesn't know that much about the financial field, to make sure that they're with someone that they can trust and is doing the job the best way they can?
And it's a weird thing for me to say as a financial planner, as a financial advisor who gets paid to do this for a living. For most people, you don't have to pay somebody, but you're going to have to do a little more work on your own. So if you don't have time for that, you don't want to do it, or it's just not your strength. A friend of mine was working on my car, and I was telling him, I can't believe people pay me. Quite honestly, still to this day, I sometimes wonder why anyone would pay me. And he says, "Why are you paying me to fix your car?" And I said, "Well, I don't have the tools." And he says, "You could buy the tools." And I go, "I don't have a garage." He goes, "You can borrow my garage." And I go, I don't want to work on my car.
Yeah.
And he goes, "That's why you're paying me. You just don't want to do it. It's not that you can't do it. And it's not that the listeners can't do it. Maybe some of them just don't want to." And so if you're into it, take your time, do the research. You can do it by yourself. It's going to be okay. But if you just don't want to, for whatever reason, I'm not here to judge you, but if you don't want to and you want to hire a financial advisor, to get to your question, the first thing you want to do is make sure that your advisor is a fiduciary. For some reason, that word is hard for me to say, has been for years. Fiduciary means that they have a moral and a legal obligation to do what is in your best interest first. So if you see an insurance salesman that says, "I think you should have an annuity," and you go, "Okay, that's great that you think I should have an annuity. Are you a fiduciary?" And they're going to go, "Well, you don't really need a fiduciary," or they'll dodge around it. They'll dance around it. It might be like Bill Clinton saying, depends on what you mean by is. What is, so you want them to be a fiduciary. If they're a fiduciary, they're probably not going to recommend something like an annuity, because they're probably recommending it because it pays a big commission. So that's in their interest, not yours. So ask if they're a fiduciary. You also want to know if they are a fee-only advisor, which means, and should mean, and they should be willing to put this in writing, that they only get paid by you, the client, via the fee they're charging you. Often they'll say fee-based, which means they'll get a fee from you and they get money from other sources. Well, then it's meaningless, but it sounds like fee only because it has fee-based. So you want a fiduciary fee-based. You also want someone that you feel like you can connect to and talk with. If you feel like you're argumentative with them or they're arguing with you, or you don't like the style or the way they're doing things, hire somebody else. And I sometimes do that with clients. I had someone recently contact me, and when I recommended this book from 1974, A Random Walk Down Wall Street, they said, how can a book from the 70s know which stocks I should pick today? And I said, I don't do stocks. I mean, I recommend stock index funds, but not specific individual stocks. And they said, well, I pick individual stocks. And I said, that's cool. That's a reasonably valid strategy, but it's not what Phil does. So I would be a bad advisor for you because I would tell you to stop doing what you just told me you wanted to do. On the extreme case, when a couple days after Trump got elected, one of my clients, and he knows who he is, one of my clients called me up and said, Phil, I want you to sell half of everything I own and put it in gold. And I said, no. And he goes, what do you mean, no? And I said, I'm not your order monkey. I have a system. I do things a certain way. And putting half of everything in gold is not one of the ways. And I could bore your listeners with why. But I said, no, I'm not going to do it. And he goes, so I could tell you to do something and you could say no. And I said, okay, well, here's the deal. You could, if you put it in writing, you put it in an email that I have to sell half of everything you own and put it in gold, I'll do it. But then I'll immediately fire you as a client. And he goes, don't you want my money? And I go, not that bad, dude. No, because why do you want to pay me if you're not following my basic advice? So, read those books, learn things. You can do it. But if you want an advisor, fee only and fiduciary.
And what about for someone if they are shorter on time, they haven't started that early? What can someone do if they're, I don't know, what age is the age that you hear someone hasn't done any investing and you think, okay, this is we got to take care of this?
Probably the most common thing I'll have is someone who is in their 50s and they've helped 1 or 2 or 3 kids go through college. And so they've not saved anything up because they saved up for college. They helped pay for college, which was great. And now let's say they're 55 and they think, well, I want to retire at 62 or 65. What do I have to do? And it's like, well, that's rough because 10%, I say, is the suck-ass minimum. Hopefully that meets the profanity filter. 10% is enough if you start when you're 22 and you want to retire when you're 65. But most people don't start saving 10% when they're 22. They start when they're 28 or 30 or 35 or 40. You really need to think about 20%. But if you start at 55 and you want to retire at 65, you might need to save 50 or 60% of what you make, or you're going to have to live on a seriously smaller amount of money when you get to retirement. And we can sit down and go over the mathematics of that. But one of the things that really does concern me is that sometimes someone might say, well, I'm retiring in 10 years. I have to take big risks to make big money. Well, if your time horizon is only 10 years and you take big risks, you could end up with next to nothing. So I'm much more comfortable taking prudent risks and having something in 10 years versus rolling the dice and being rich in 10 years, but probably more likely being broke in 10 years because you don't want to end up in a single wide living on your Social Security check. That's not, most people don't have that plan. So it's all about that prudent balance. But if you're listening, start early and save as much or more than you think you can.
And if someone just thinks, I'm not going to worry about it, I'll deal with that later and never invests, do you meet people like that? And what?
Yeah, everyone has a unique strategy. There are those people that think, I'm never going to live to 62, so why would I save? Okay, those are personal choices that you make. You obviously would never hire me. There might not even be a point of you listening to my show because you're never going to get past that first step of having money to save, to invest. I even had a client that said, I want to retire at 65, and then I want you to figure out the maximum amount I can take out so I go broke at the age of 80. And I said, why at the age of 80? And he says, no one in my family has ever made it to 80, so I want to spend the money as fast as possible so I don't end up dying with all this money left over. And I said, okay, well, what happens when you're 81 and you got lucky and then you have no money left? And he says, I'll just go and live in the county nursing home. I was like, okay, well, we need to talk some more because Phil has a problem with that plan. But if that's what you really, really want and you insist on that and you put it in writing, maybe even a couple of times I'm going to have you put it in writing, I can do that. Because the thing that scares me is that when you turn 81, and if you have a spouse or if you have a kids or you die at 81 and the kids come back and go, how was he broke? I have to explain it. I got to go, here's the emails where you insisted that I help you spend all your money. Not helping you spend it, but help you spend your money, not us spending it. But you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. I think this is generally good advice. And I wonder if, because you work in that industry and you have this podcast that gets, I don't know how many listeners on a monthly basis, that the people that you mostly come in contact with have pretty good ideas of wanting to invest, trying to invest, and that's the type of people you talk to. But I feel like in my life, I come across a lot of people that just don't think about it, don't do it, have done it completely differently than I am right now. And I find it interesting because there are so many different lines of thought. And I feel like you're on a very good track. And that's why I'm talking to you right now, because I feel like you've influenced me to make good choices in that area. But some people, everyone has a different type of upbringing. If money is taught differently, how to handle it, how to save it, people are in such different places.
You're absolutely right. And sometimes I do get the phone calls and emails that are really the heartbreaking ones, where it's a single parent who's 45, struggling to pay the bills, struggling to pay the gas bill. Oh, the air conditioner ran too much this month. I can't pay the entire electric bill. I'm going to have to string it out for a couple of months. I can't afford enough groceries. How does that person start saving and investing for retirement? I don't know. I don't have easy answers for that. Sometimes you can be in a situation that I'm not the person to help fix it. I don't know who it might be, but that's not my skill strength. But yes, I'm aware of that. If you can save even $100 a month, $50 a month, one thing you can do is you can go to Vanguard or Fidelity or Schwab or TD Ameritrade, other major broker dealers, and you can open up an account. Vanguard, you need $1,000 right now to start buying some of their target date funds. So you could buy like a 2050 or 2055 or 2060 target date fund. You only need $1,000. Fidelity just changed their minimums to zero for two of their funds. And one of them I really love for a new investor. Even if you only have $100, you can open up an account and put $100 in the total stock market fund, where you own a incredibly small fraction of every single stock in the United States of America. You only need $100. So that's a way you can start. I did a show on Acorns. It's one of these apps you can put on your phone. And I kind of thought it was amusing, kind of cutesy, but harmless. And when I really dug into it, I ended up doing a whole show on why it was actually quite horrible. It is not a way to start building wealth.
And I feel like, although they may not be a good way to start building wealth, they're probably doing a better job of marketing, or maybe a couple companies like that, because I see an ad for that thing and maybe something similar on some of the social media apps. And I feel like, okay, I know not to use that, in part because I've listened to your show and got a better understanding. But if someone hasn't done any investing, I feel like someone that knows less is more likely to get into that, and it's just probably not the place to be.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that Acorns and many others, they do great advertising. They make a great looking app. It's very slick. It looks very cool. It's very user friendly. And on the surface, it seems totally harmless. And you think, what can it hurt to round up to the next dollar? And I don't want to get into all the details, but there are things that are hidden in the details that can hurt you. You could save and invest part of $1 here and there for a couple of years and think that you have $2,000. And then when you tell you to take the money out, you have dramatically less, or you underperformed. You would be far better off to open that account at Fidelity and send $50 a month in the total stock market index and just set it up on auto pay and just forget about it. Ideally you save thousands or more. Ideally you're saving 20% of your income or more. Bigger is better. As the more you save, the faster you could get to retirement. But like I said, the problem with someone with $50 or $100 is that they only have 50 or $100. It doesn't matter how smart your investing is. If you can only save $50 a month, you probably will never be able to retire except for Social Security or a pension.
And I'm in a pretty good situation. I'm single, no kids, have a few different kinds of income. But one thing I realized a few years ago is I didn't want to save all this money for retirement. I thought because I want to live now and do more things now. So I started doing more cool, fun, adventurous things, and I had less money. And then I was kind of in a tough spot, and I just realized as time went on that, okay, I can just work harder, make more money, I can invest, I can have fun now, I can do it all. And for me, based on my lifestyle, I've been able to do that. Not everyone has as few responsibilities as me. I understand that. But I do think just the attitude of, okay, I got to find a way to spend less on things that really aren't giving me as much value as I think they are, or find a way to get more hours at my job or another job. There are ways, I think, to have more money into the month. It's just you got to break out of habits that might not be best habits.
Yeah, you might have to cook in bulk, where you cook a meal in scale, so you have food for 7 dinners in a row, and you're eating the same thing for 7 days, but the cost of making that food is ridiculously cheap compared to making 7 different meals or eating out.
Yeah.
Because eating out, you can spend $10, $20, $30, $50 a meal. Buying food and cooking it can be $1 or $2 per meal. If you buy some raw ingredients and cook something, you can make $1 meals or less. But coupons, I don't know if it's everywhere in the country, but I love going to a store called Aldi.
That's where I shop for my groceries.
Because you can buy things comically low prices. But sometimes it's nice to go to a fancier grocery store and get a few luxury items there. But just be really careful about what you choose. Another big expense that really wipes out a lot of people is housing. So for me, housing is an expense. Houses are not an investment. I know some of your listeners are going to be yelling at me right now. They are an investment, but that's my position. They're not an investment. Occasionally they happen to be. And if they're an investment at all, for most people, they're a really poor investment. Every once in a while you hear a story where someone buys a house and it doubles in 5 or 10 years. It can happen, but for most people it doesn't happen. And cars. Cars are very expensive, and if you're having trouble making ends meet, don't buy a new car. Buy a replacement car. So if you need a newer car, you buy a 5 or 6 year old car, and you do the research on which ones never need repairs, and you can keep your car costs way down. Don't lease. Never lease a car unless you have money and you don't care if it goes away. Mm-hmm. You just want the luxury of the car. So those are some things. Food, housing, and cars are usually 3 big things that wipe people out, that it kind of sneaks up on them and they don't think that they could spend a lot less, but they might be able to.
Let's turn the topic now, Phil. The reason that I met you, the reason that we're talking right now, is we're at a convention. In fact, on episode 4, if you haven't seen listened to episode 4 of the podcast, it dropped the same day we're recording this is the day that I came out as an atheist on my podcast, which was a big thing for me because people that aren't familiar really with that term, or people that are atheists, I don't know what kind of response it'll get. So it's kind of a big thing. When this episode airs, I'm not sure exactly, but that's how I met you. That's the other big part of your life, and the other half, or the other 2/3 of your podcasts. So I guess I want to hear your story, or I guess the audience, I'd like the listener to hear your story a little bit of why this is a big part of your life also.
Yeah, and I just thought, I don't think I've mentioned the podcast is The Phil Ferguson Show. Of course, my name is Phil Ferguson, and I'm a naming savant. That's why I came up with such a uniquely clever name. But yeah, the cheeky way of me referencing my show is it's 1/3 finance, 2/3 atheism. I'm number 1 in that category. To my knowledge, I'm the only one in that category. But the atheism, I was in confirmation class at a Methodist church when I was 13. And I'm of a certain age, God, I'm getting old, that at that same time when I was in confirmation class on TV every week was this new show on PBS called Cosmos with Carl Sagan. And I had to go into my parents' room and watch it on the second TV. So we were really, really well off. We had a second TV. It was black and white, and it was 13-inch. And I watched Cosmos on a 13-inch black and white TV while my parents were watching The Love Boat on the big 19-inch black and white TV. See, that's how well off we were.
Fancy.
And every week I would watch Cosmos and think, we are all made of star stuff. And how beautiful of a story that is. And how majestic and awesome science is. And you can learn things about things. You can understand at least some about how the world works and how things come together and how things interact, and chemistry, biology, genetics, plate tectonics, all this stuff. And the more you learn, the more sense it makes. You can become an expert in it. And I looked at people in the field of religion, and it seemed like the more I asked, the stupider it got. And I was in this confirmation class, and I would talk to the minister, and I didn't feel like I could get a straight answer. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm 13. The minister had to graduate high school, 18, had to go through seminary. There's a funny word for a religious school for you, seminary. And so he's probably at least in his mid-20s, if not older, and he studied this for a living for many years, and he can't give a cogent answer to a simple question to a 13-year-old. And I'm thinking, how is that possible? How can they not give a straight-up answer? And I would ask teachers in school, and they would say, oh, no, I can't talk to you about that, which is the right answer, teachers. You're not there to proselytize in or out of religion anybody. That's not your job. But it pissed me off as a 13-year-old. I would talk to my parents. They didn't really have answers because they just believed. They've always believed. And so, I had this hour-long sit-down meeting with a minister one time, longest hour of my life. And yes, everyone's clothes stayed on. No, I'm sorry. Too Catholic of a joke. Too soon. But
I don't think I think the news has been out for a while.
Yeah. And I finally told the minister, I said, I'm just not convinced. I'm not saying you're wrong, but if I'm supposed to stand up at the end of confirmation class after 9 months of gestation for confirmation class in the Methodist Church and to tell everybody I believe this and I will forever and ever, I'm not ready for that. And he said, just do it for your parents. And I was like, oh, shit. I've been taking this serious. This is just something we do. Okay, fine. If it's just a game, I'll do it. But that was it. I was done. And so I would joke with people that moment I became an atheist and I was convinced and I started using the word. And then when I went to college, I read the Bible from beginning to end. And I said I became an atheist a second time. And then years later, as an adult, after my wife and I had kids, I started pretending to be a Missouri Synod Lutheran. And I was actually on the school board, and I saw how Christians behaved, and I became an atheist a third time. That's kind of a joke thing, but once you're an atheist, well, at least for me, it stuck. But the things I've seen Christians do, they don't live any better. They don't have any better morality or virtues, and sometimes they're worse because they can claim they have higher values. And so that stuff's always bothered me. And then I had a time period when I worked for the man. While I still had my business, I worked in this place called Arkansas. It's right below Missouri. Yes, I say it wrong on purpose. We can discuss that later. But I saw what it was like when the government was run by religion, and it kind of freaked me out. And that's what made me become an advocate. That's what made me become an activist. And that's why I'm here as an example at the FFRF, Freedom from Religion Conference, and I go to many other conferences. I support things. And my podcast, by the way, listeners, we just finished a fundraiser for the Secular Student Alliance, where with the help of my listeners, we raised $42,000 to help college and a few high school and apparently one new junior high group be able to speak out and create a warm and open and welcoming space for secular students. And so that's the kind of stuff that I love to do. And slowly, one person here, one person there, I want to change the world. And I do call myself an evangelical atheist. So I think atheism is more right than religion. And I want to tell everybody about it. So that makes me an evangelical atheist.
And I don't know that that's where I am now, if I ever will do that. But I feel like my podcast is about how different people have affected my life and how I've changed. And I just want to introduce people like you, people like maybe some other guests I'll have that think differently. And I think what happens is some people don't even realize it's an option to think differently, because if you're surrounded by people that think like you, that doesn't seem like it's an option. But you've found a path for you to think differently, and I've gotten my path here. Maybe I don't necessarily, not everybody needs to think the way that we think, but Phil's normal. I'm looking at him. He looks like a normal guy, and he really means the best for people in every way that I can tell. And I think I do as well. And I guess if someone's never known someone like that calls himself an atheist, but is also doing good things in the world or attempting to, I guess we exist. And that's my step that I want to at least do for now.
Yeah. And I try to do the right thing, but, I often get things wrong and I make mistakes.
Well, I think that is a good transition into the being wrong segment. Phil, tell me something that you are wrong about. We're wrong about, but are not wrong about anymore.
But it's funny. I think of a story. I was arguing with a lady once, and she said, Phil, you know what your problem is? I'm like, oh, please, do tell me what is my problem. And she says, you think you're always right. And I thought about it for a second, and I go, so do you hold positions or beliefs that you know are wrong? She goes, what? And I go, you're concerned that I think I'm always right. Do you not think that you're always right? Do you believe things that you know are wrong? And she's like, okay, well, that's not what I mean. And I go, okay, maybe it was a poor word choice. Please rephrase it. And she goes, well, if I could convince you of something that you think is true, that it was wrong, would you change your mind? And I go, yeah, absolutely. But with the new evidence that you gave me would change my mind. As soon as I change my mind, I would be right again. So it's kind of funny. So I don't see a problem with being wrong. But one of the examples I love to give, I used to think that all psychics were charlatans. And that opinion changed. I don't think that all psychics are charlatans. I don't think there's such a thing as a psychic power, because I could tell you're looking at me going, wait a minute, where are you going with this? I don't think they have any special skills, supernatural skills, I'll say. But there are people, I am convinced, that don't appreciate their ability to read people, their ability to guess what someone's going through, their ability to do what's called cold reading or even warm reading. And I came to this because I studied cold reading for a while, and then I did a cold reading on somebody. It was actually a young lady that would cut my hair every month or two. And I did a cold reading on her. And one of the things I said to her that, for example, I said, I'm getting the impression that you're not getting paid enough in your job. And she's like, oh my God, how did you know? Well, okay, first of all, like 95% of all people don't think they're getting paid enough to do their job. So that's a educated guess that applies to almost everybody. And then we started talking about a friend of hers, and I assumed that her friend had a crappy car. And she's like, oh my God, how did you know? And I was thinking, well, you're 25, you're cutting hair, you probably don't make a ton of money, you're not buying a Porsche or an Audi or a Lamborghini. People often hang out with people that are roughly the same age and the same socioeconomic status, which can be a problem, but we tend to do that as humans. So if you don't make a whole lot of money, I can assume relatively safely that your friend doesn't make a whole lot of money. And if you don't make a whole lot of money, you have a crappy car, because that's all you can afford. That's all I could afford when I was in my 20s. So, but she was freaking out that I knew about her friend, which I didn't, because she told me. I knew about her friend's car, which I didn't. I just dropped a few words. And then there's this process of remembering the hits and forgetting the misses, which is part of the magic of a psychic reading. I have my magic air quotes up. So if I didn't know all those techniques, and if I didn't know exactly what I was doing, and she kept telling me that I was right, I could see how I could become convinced that I was on to something, that I was doing something that I can't explain, that maybe is supernatural. And if I intended to do that for the purpose of doing good and helping people, I would not be the charlatan. Now, the people that are on TV, the people that have giant crowds of thousands of people, I'm placing my money squarely on the box that says they're scammers and that they know what they're doing. But there's other people that just think that they have a power. Maybe it's because they just don't understand how the world works. They don't understand what cold reading is. They don't understand the process of remembering the hits and forgetting the misses. When I was in high school, I thought my dad was a stock picking genius because he would tell us about the stocks that went up 2, 5, 10 times. But a few years later, when he showed me everything that he owned, I found out he was underperforming the stock market. I was convinced he was a stock picking genius. He thought he was doing better than average, but he was doing well below average because he remembered the stocks that did well, and pushed out of his mind the stocks that didn't do well.
Yeah, why would he want to brag about all the ones he did poorly?
Right. We're human beings. We do these weird things, and so it's very easy. So that's something where I always thought every psychic was a scammer intentionally. And as I learned more about it, I found out that not all of them are, some of them are well-meaning, and they just don't know what they're doing, and they think they have something and they want to help people. And I can't really fault them too much for doing that, but there are plenty of scammers. Psychic is not a power. It's not a supernatural thing. It doesn't work, but they may not think that. So they may be acting genuinely and honestly.
I think that's common where people, like, for instance, if you're raised with whatever values and maybe religious views that your parents teach you, whether or not it's true, if they're doing it because they have good intentions, they believe it, and it can be good. But of course, ultimately, I seek the truth, and I'd imagine you do as well, and that's very important.
I try my best, and there's times that I make mistakes and I screw things up. And it reminds me of a funny thing on my show. There was a couple of weeks where I had made mistakes a few weeks in a row, and I would come on a few weeks later and go, I said this thing 2 weeks ago. Here's what I said. I had a listener pointed out that I was wrong. I double-checked what they said. They were right. I was wrong. Here's the correction. And a few of them happened a few weeks or a few months in a row. And a few people contacted me and said, stop correcting yourself. You're hurting your credibility. And my response was basically, if that bothers you, stop listening to my show. Because investing is complicated. I've only done this for 23 years. I don't know everything. Things change on a regular basis. I will make mistakes. I will make more mistakes. And I am delighted, as long as they're nice about it. If someone hears me do something that's wrong and can educate me, I can share that with the listeners so that we all get a better experience out of it. I see that as a value add, not as a problem. And so I told the people that if you don't like that, don't listen to my show. But it's kind of that weird thing in America now. There's a growing number of people that are just going to say whatever they want. It doesn't matter if it's true or not, and they're just going to double down and never admit fault. That I can't do that.
I can't either. One last chance, Phil, for someone listening right now. What are the things in your life that you want to tell them about and have a chance for them to connect with you in some way in the future?
I appreciate that. They can find me on Facebook, Phil Ferguson. There's also a page for the show, The Phil Ferguson Show. They can follow me on Twitter at Skeptic Money. The podcast is The Phil Ferguson Show, and I'll make a special offer to your listeners. If they send me an email, please do not include any personal identifying information. I mean, you can have your name and phone number, but don't put your social security number or any tax documents or statements. But if you want to have 30 minutes where we can talk, send me an email. Say that you're a listener of this show.
People I Know show.
Yeah. And remind me that I've said this, on the show, and I'll send you some possible times we can meet and we can sit down in 30 minutes and you ask me anything you want to ask. If you want me to look at your statement and say, yeah, it's pretty good, or no, it's awful and here's why, I'll do that. There's no intent for you to hire me. There's no requirement on your part. I just like to help people, and I'm kind of a lift all boats kind of guy. So if you're listening to the show and you want to do that, email me, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com. And those are the things that you can find me and listen to the show. I appreciate you being on your show. Thank you so much.
That's Phil Ferguson. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for listening to another episode of People I Know Show. All of the contact information that Phil spoke about is linked in today's episode's show notes. Please take a moment on Apple Podcasts or whichever app or website you use to listen to the program to rate and review People I Know Show. Remember, you can check us out on Facebook or Instagram by searching People I Know Show. And if you have any general questions or comments for me, you can email to peopleiknowshow@gmail.com.